Uh, I'm just going to talk about my book, which had a kind of conceptual agenda. I'm just going to read this out, and if you have any questions after, you can ask. A reflection on the potential for poetic revolt in post-conflict Northern Irish poetry, which was an idea I had when I was bored shitless with the status quo, and which might be of use to others in similar political circumstances or who just want to have some fun with their brains and language. I will speak of my own experiments in devising a totally idiosyncratic political agenda for my own poetic production that determinately challenges oppressive ideologies I have personally confronted. I was born in Northern Ireland in 1982 with the sectarian conflict known as the Troubles in full momentum. When growing up, I was aware of the unnerving and perpetual threat of imminent violence, the realities of religiously inflected, or maybe I should say infected, socio-political conflict based on two polarized, vehemently opposed ideologies. This happens when you wake up as a kid and you watch the news, mouthful of snack, crackle and pop, and you see that nearly every day, for as long as you can remember, and can't imagine it relenting, that there has been a kneecapping or other form of punishment shooting, a random and brutal sectarian murder or a specific retaliatory assassination, maybe a bomb indiscriminately destroying collective lives and morale for a better future, or at least a bomb scare unsettling the already dubious and delusional sense of security enforced by the occupying and often including British military. I regard the Troubles as a socio-political phenomenon that incurred a form of psychological trauma for the citizens of Northern Ireland, particularly for those whose formative years endured the worst years of the conflict, commonly referred to in the post-conflict political arena by politician and pundit alike as the dark days of the past, a description itself best described as a weak metaphor for an unapologetic era of the ignorant fanatic begetting the ignorant fanatic. As Northern Ireland now works through a difficult time of attempted reconciliation, the predominant question everyone is trying to answer is how do we deal with the past? This was the question I asked myself on a personal level with regards extricating myself from the formalist Northern Irish poetic tradition that engaged with the conflict in a crisis of witnessing. My ambition was to establish potential poetic methods to negate the traumatic legacy of the Troubles and compose a creative text of political agency by means of its merits of experimental production and innovative form of communication. My initial interest and impetus was to develop a poetics of anamnesis, i.e. remembering, that would be based on a subjective revolt in language, a revolt that investigated subjectivity as a process in which the reconnaissance of memory, here in the form of recalling the trauma of the Northern Irish Troubles from the perspective of my adult self, would be processed and expressed as a reconfiguration via the poetic. This reconfiguration would take the form of a sequence of interconnected poems that will illustrate the lyric eye in a transhistorical non-linear narrative of reflection, as a subject present, and as noted as process and in process, excavating the trauma of the past by means of a performative poetic exploration in order to eventually escape the trauma's psychic reach, so as to consider other subjects with which to work against or have fun with. So the issue is, in Northern Ireland, that you either play ball or you don't play kind of thing. Everyone's still kind of really interested in the kind of Ulster Renaissance, and if you don't know what the Ulster Renaissance was, it was kind of like Seamus Heaney, Derek Mahan, Michael Longley, Maeve McGuckin, all these kind of poets that came through Queen's University. I began to develop the cynicism that the legacy of the Troubles as a source of thematic and poetic content was making permissible for contemporary readers a primary engagement with oblique poetic anecdotes, formulaic reference of the conflict, composed from a reductive perspective fostered by the insular outlook inherent in Northern Ireland's provincialism and political vacuum, and the staid conventions of traditional lyric voice in contemporary Northern Irish poetry. It's kind of this thing of like, you know, like Irish fucking postcards and shit, like where there's like a bath in the field and like a cow and some old man with a walking stick. It's kind of like that sort of aesthetic agenda seems to be propagated. It's like tourism or something. It seemed logical to argue that experience is off and the legacy of the Troubles as represented in traditional contemporary Northern Irish poetry was and is a fetishistic genre commodity that instigates a monotony of the lyric, stifling dynamism and innovation, but one that satiates readers of the mainstream Irish and British magazines and publishing houses. I believed that the only way to write about the legacy of the Troubles innovatively was from a stance of refusal, a refusal of the responsibility and expectation to buy into this genre commodity fetishism. And I can't really stress enough how much responsibility and expectation there is on Northern Irish poets to investigate these things in the kind of oblique way I have mentioned. My approach was indebted to avant-garde experimentation and informed by the attitude of punk. Punk is a material exploration of how a specific set of illicit desires repressed within a dominant social order return to haunt it, and in the best cases blast cracks in its surface. I must say as well that I'm referencing some things in this, but due to it not really being an academic context, I'm just letting it flow. The crucial strategy for literary punk aesthetics is motion, a flow of styles. As such, I was interested in dichotomies, specifically in the clashes of register between the rural and the metropolitan, the apolitical and the political, and the virtual and the material. Considering this, it seemed natural to present my book Pangs as an attempt to exemplify a contemporary rendition of Menippean satire. The Menippean satire, if it can be defined at all, might be best described as a literary mode of practice that is constituted by the intertextual collocation of numerous and often disparate elements, a skeptical, bitter, even caustic tone, a cluster of clearly identifiable motifs and images that can be catalogued, a reoccurrence of certain plot patterns, and always the aim to deflate. It should be said then that Menippean satire as a discourse attempts to expand conventional generic boundaries in an attempt to subvert the context of material reality by fictionalizing material reality in a way that it redefines its boundaries, attempting their complete dissolution so as to expose the presumptive nature of ideological absolutes. The Carnivalesque reveals with the collapse of hierarchical distinctions a basic commonality of human experience and the factitiousness of all systems of rationalization for the exclusion or oppression of marginal groups, i.e. in the context of Northern Irish poetry, avant-garde experimental transgressive poets. The goading mockery offered by Menippean satire is often conducted through the undermining of highbrow lexicons via juxtaposition of quotidian colloquial speech, with exemplary representations of grotesqueries, resulting in the encouragement of common sense wisdom over the indoctrinating pretensions of church and state, which act as oppressors and inhibit the consolation of individual autonomy. I wanted to expose and undermine the lumber of stereotypes, fossilized beliefs, superstitious terrors, crank theories, pedantic dogmatisms, oppressive fashions, and all other ideological and cultural variables that disaffect the individual in contemporary Northern Ireland. Menippean discourse extols a form of comic erudition and self-reflective, self-conscious self-mockery. Therefore, the poems required that I mock my own self-professed confessed poetic self. The cliched idea of the poet as a grandiose, self-referential spectacle of oneself, I decided was necessary to satirize in order to achieve a phenomenon of language inquiring into itself, into a multitudinous, manifold reality in which even the subjectivity of the poet has a multitudinous, almost schizoid expression that unifies all the elements of its dialogic discourse in the playful adventures of ideas and their digressions. The most important manifestations of this playfulness are the transgressions and heuristic explorations of the affected lyric voice, in this context affected by the traumatic legacy of the Troubles. Also, I will say I'll mention a little bit about Julia Kristeva, but I didn't really want to talk too much about Kristeva because of all the kind of theoretical references and so on. Where was I? Yeah, so it's essentially an attempt to dismantle binary operations and receive forms and perceptions as well as textual orthodoxies that are mutually inclusive of society and self. So the kind of the talking, you know, kind of like Bakhtin and so on in the Carnivalesque, the content of Menippean satire brims with subversive energy as a reservoir of various indecent expressions and speech patterns that have been ostracized from official formal discourse. And I guess the thing to remember about Northern Ireland is that it's a really ridiculously religious place. Recently, it's been, they won't, basically gay marriage, they've tried to put it through government now, I think 3 times, and they keep using all these loopholes to close it down. It's a very, it's full of religious zealots, basically. And young people aren't very politically active or anything, so there's not much of a challenge to that. The main linguistic elements of the Menippean satire are founded on an unconventional diction produced by the use of neologisms, portmanteau words, precocity, coarse vulgarity, bombast, and protracted sentences. The aim of Menippean satire is to ridicule or caricature societies that are invested in what the author views as an ideological fraud, undermining cultural authority, and at the same time undermining a literary authority. Again, don't take yourself too fucking seriously. I was inspired when producing my Menippean satire by the Kristevan idea that a revolution in poetic language is not only inseparable from subjectivity, but also from the political, insofar as the activity of the cultural avant-garde will affect all discourse and then therefore infiltrate the political arena with the aim to reevaluate art and political engagement, and in doing so present avant-garde poetry as a source of political agency, a creative writing that affects social action. Now, the issue that I have with this is that I don't know if that is... I think it's a theoretical potential, but as yet I don't know if it's... And I think that's what I found interesting yesterday between Clement's point and Anne's point and these sorts of ideas of like, is it fucking possible to change anything? I think the potential's there, but anyway. Kristeva's challenge to the deductive idea of language is a strictly formal object governed by mathematics and ruled by syntax. So she's challenging this idea basically. Again, it's just talking about fucking all this post-structuralist bullshit. So anyway, yeah, okay. So basically, the subject is not extraneous to the signifying process, and so where am I? Yeah. So basically, I'm basically saying I don't want to talk about post-structuralism. But I will a little bit. So for Kristeva, the subject is like a subject in process. And for her, there was no distinction between language and subjectivity. So it's kind of like a biophysical kind of the pulsions and drives and so on. Where am I? So yeah, so these kind of like the pulsions and drives of the biophysical subject are discharged into language, affecting language, and this is a relationship of reciprocity with language again in turning affecting the biological drives and energies of the subject, and this seems to just kind of go on ad infinitum. So again, I'm kind of like have this quandary of like, can we affect anything with literature, or are we just like a fucking hamster in a cage? I don't want to be, but I'm still trying to figure it out. So yeah. Yeah, I think this is kind of important as well, like the idea between the symbolic order and like symbolic discourse and the semiotic disposition and like concentration and distraction, which as you can see I'm, vulnerable to. I think it's really important to render that in some sort of literary form. So whenever I was producing my book, that's what I tried to do, and then I wanted to, so I used like Menippean satire as a template, and they kind of tried to think about Kristeva's ideas to produce these sets of poems, and then I wanted to destroy that or negate that again. So I used the cut-up technique, Burroughsian, and I guess going back to Zara as well. And this was as a further conceptual gesture which would serve to reenact an explosion of this kind of traumatic legacy of the Troubles itself, which I had already deliberately negated, as I said, in the 2 previous kind of approaches. So this seemed to be conceptually congruent, as the relevant frequency of bomb explosions during the era of the Troubles was one of the predominant influences of the trauma, So it's, you know, it's like a stupid metaphor, but it also alluded to the post-conflict socio-political procedures and ascertaining how the people and politicians of contemporary Northern Ireland can effectively deal with the past through a re-evaluation in testimony of how it goes. And I don't know, there's quite a lot of stuff I left out about like the legacy of the Troubles Report and the consultative group in the past, and a lot of people kind of being, it's like it's just still going on in a way. So yeah, I could say something like about radical empathy and focused interiority, but I think that's maybe for a different time. But I think that that's, for me, like with regards to the Chris Steven idea and with regards actually literature and composition, I think that a kind of focused interiority is the way to live a life, and kind of individuation, and whenever one consolidates oneself with oneself to look outward with a real radical empathy and take back control or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert.